Cé fáilte le gach duine atá linn den códáil speisialta seo. A rit na tróna ba muid ag breanú ar starúil don tír seo, cogadh na tír seo. Ba muid ag fálam faoi an cogadh seo I Ceantar Connemara. On behalf of the Clifden and Connemara Heritage Society, I welcome you all to this virtual conference, which looks at the very historic time of our community, the War of Independence. This conference will look especially at the effects of this war on the region of Connemara. I welcome all our distinguished speakers who will give us a better understanding of the important time throughout Ireland, but particularly in Connemara. The speakers, of course, are a lovely mixture of people from the Connemara area who have direct connections to this particular time in the 1920s, and also people who have written extensively on the history of that particular time. And I thank them all for sharing with us. Special thanks to Professor Gearóid Ó Tuathaigh, to Professor Irene M. Whelan, to Kathleen Villiers-Tuttle, to Dr. Conor McNamara and Verena Rowe. And a very special word of thanks to Marie Mannion and all of her team at Galway County Council. This particular time, as I say, when we're looking at 1920-21 period, in 1920s, Connemara was actually a fairly quiet time, but that all changed in March of 1921. And this conference is going to look at the effect that that had on the community of the area, and particularly on the Whelan family, when Thomas Whelan, or Tommy Whelan of Gortrummagh, just out of side of Clifden, was one of the unlikely victims in that particular time. So I hope you enjoy the afternoon. Thank you for being part of this, and go raibh go léir.
Good afternoon, agus fáilte isteach. I marvel at the wonders of modern technology and the wizardry of those who operate it, so as to enable us to have seminars online just like today's. But I must confess that even after a year of intermittent Zooming, I still find this disembodied medium a little unsettling. But let us give thanks for the fact that we can talk together. And may I express my gratitude to the organizers of this seminar for inviting me to participate. The events surrounding the execution of Thomas Whelan on the 14th of March 1921, the personal as well as the particular Galway dimensions of the tragedy, will be considered in talks throughout this afternoon by Irene, Kathleen, Conor, and Zarina. My own purpose at the start of this session, in this opening talk, is to suggest a context, a framework, if you like, in Anglo-Irish relations, in the condition of Ireland itself at the time, and in the conflict, the War of Independence, and the state it had reached in the spring of 1921. A context within which the story of Thomas Whelan and his execution might be usefully considered. It is customary, and in a sense only natural perhaps, that in accounts of the Anglo-Irish relationship in these critical years, emphasis very often, or the focus very often, is heavily upon the military aspect of the conflict, the events and the features of the War of Independence, the heroic and indeed the darker deeds. But of course, the War of Independence, as with all wars, including guerrilla wars, took place in a very particular political and indeed social setting. And it is to that that I want to give attention in the first instance. The major player, so to speak, the dominant party in the drama of politics at this time was, of course, the British government. A British government in the aftermath of World War I. A British government which had been one of the victor powers, but was hugely exhausted and dislocated at the end of the war. Huge economic resources had been deployed. The country was trying to count the cost of the war. And already in Egypt and in India, and of course here in Ireland, the stirrings against empire were already becoming apparent. The Prime Minister at the time, Lloyd George, was a Prime Minister without a solid parliamentary following. He was the Prime Minister of a coalition government, but his own original party, the Liberal Party, was bitterly split. And he was Prime Minister, in fact, at the behest, really, of the large Conservative Party. The large Conservative Party, many of whose backbenchers were becoming restive and were thinking that he had served his time. This Conservative Party was led by Andrew Bonar Law, a stern unionist. Indeed, he had been the most unconditional supporter of the intransigence of the Ulster Unionists from the beginning of the Irish crisis a decade before. As it happened, the first priority for Lloyd George, therefore, was to try and keep himself in power and keep this coalition in office. He was fortunate that some politicians in his own party and elsewhere felt that he had still had the best chance, that he was the politician with the best chance of sorting out one of the most intractable of the post-war problems for a British government, namely the problem of Ireland. This was an opinion, by the way, that Lloyd George himself was not averse to encouraging. The first priority, of course, not just for Bonar Law, but for the government, was Ulster. And that was the priority, essentially, that was best served by the major initiative of 1920. That is to say, the Government of Ireland Act of 1920, setting up two parliaments, two subsidiary parliaments, Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, with a Council of Ireland through which they could cooperate if they so wished. It was accepted by the Ulster Unionist Party, though it meant sacrificing 3 counties of Ulster. And in fact, it made its way through Parliament throughout 1920, being introduced in February and becoming law at the very end of the year. In that sense, the Ulster problem, so to speak, from the government point of view, was being solved throughout 1920. Meanwhile, in Dublin itself, the headquarters, so to speak, the central point of the British administration in Ireland, Dublin Castle had seen the arrival of a number of administrative officers, senior administrators or bureaucrats in the middle of 1920, and they had undertaken reforms in order to make the castle more responsive, as it were, to the changing situation in Ireland. They were alert to the possibilities of some political dialogue being necessary with the new leaders, as it were, of Irish nationalist opinion. But on the other hand, if they could be counted doves, as Michael Portillo tended to do in his television series a little while back, the hawks, those who wanted a military solution in the first instance, namely the suppression of the Dáil and of Sinn Féin and of the IRA and the Irish Rebellion or secession, they generally had the ear of the leading politicians in London. Public opinion was an important factor for British governments. Public opinion throughout the Commonwealth, public opinion in North America, in the Anglophone world. And public opinion was responsive to the propaganda from Ireland about British excesses and atrocities. And in fact, notwithstanding the fact that the British had a very formidable, if you like, architecture of publicity and propaganda themselves, they were aware that the publicity was working against them. And in particular at home, among liberal and strands of Labour opinion, the reports of the atrocities of some of the Crown forces in Ireland and the general on-the-spot reporting was leading to all sorts of unease among supporters of the government, that some of the British Crown forces in Ireland were behaving in a manner that was not dissimilar to what had been denounced throughout the war as German atrocities in continental Europe. Now, the options, therefore, in the spring of 1921, so far as the British government were concerned, had to do really with the political situation. Would they open up or would they tease out the possibility of discussions with the leaders of nationalist opinion, now that the Government of Ireland Act had effectively run, or would they double down on the military effort to effectively suppress the rebellion in Ireland? When we look at the Irish political context, then, the Republican, if you like, Sinn Féin leadership of the Dáil, the secessionists, as it were, we find that the Dáil itself was in a difficult situation. This is the Dáil that was representative, really, of nationalist opinion since the general election of 1918. It had huge difficulties. It was pronounced illegal at the end of 1919, and accordingly, there was real issues about what exactly it could do and how it could function. Its meetings were infrequent, and there was a constant tension between the central authority in the Dáil, what it actually could control, and the local autonomy of leaders and of those who took the initiatives. And that was true not only of military, but of general political initiatives. When we consider, for example, that the Dáil met 13 times between January of 1919 and September of 1919, when it was declared illegal, but thereafter, it met only 8 more times from September 1919 to the Truce of July 1921. And it operated at all times under very severe financial and indeed legal constraints. There was a couple of other things that were material to what was the situation, the political landscape in the Dáil and in the Republican leadership. There were early tensions and rivalries between large personalities. Not all of these had to do with how the military campaign should be waged. There were competing or bruising egos involved. And it seems, obviously, in retrospect now, in light of what would happen after the treaty, we can see perhaps that these tensions and rivalries were more serious than contemporaries in the spring of 1920 might have guessed, but they were real. One of the things that is important, however, to remember is that De Valera's return to Ireland from America, having been absent for a year and a half, his return in December of 1920 made a major impact on the dynamics of leadership, not least the question of what would be his relationship with Michael Collins, because Collins, of course, had been the key figure. He had occupied the key pivotal role during the previous year and a half in terms of not only the intelligence gathering and the operations of the War of Independence, but also as finance minister of the Dáil. And he wore multiple hats, of course, at all times, in the IRB, in the IRA, and in the Dáil. He was, in effect, seen as the director, so to speak, of the war effort. One further complication: the Sinn Féin leadership largely determined to ignore the Government of Ireland Act of 1920 and certainly to have no truck with the proposals that it set up for a Southern Parliament, save this, that they resolved to take the opportunity in May of 1921, when a general election was scheduled to take place under the Government of Ireland Act to elect representatives for the Southern Parliament. Sinn Féin leaders decided to take the opportunity to simply take the election as an opportunity to renew the mandate of Sinn Féin, and only Sinn Féin candidates were nominated throughout all of those constituencies which would have elected to the Southern Parliament. But otherwise, the idea was, or the belief was among Sinn Féin leadership, in fact, that the Government of Ireland Act would be quickly superseded by a larger settlement, pretty well like the Irish Convention of 1917, that it would become redundant and in a short time, when a larger settlement was made between the British government and the Dáil, or the Republican leadership. In effect, they assumed, and many nationalists in Northern Ireland, as it would become, also assumed, that in effect, everything was still to play for and the issues were wide open. This proved to be a miscalculation. Craig and the Ulster Unionist leadership had a much clearer understanding of what could be done with the Government of Ireland Act, and effectively were busy building the apparatus of their new administration in the north, even as the Sinn Féin delegates sought to find new ways to get their agenda, as it were, working. Politics at local level, when we turn to it, hinges really on the local elections of 1920. In January, the local elections had to do with urban and urban districts, and in the middle of the summer with county councils. Sinn Féin scored a major victory in both. In the urban and urban district elections, they were the majority party in most of the constituencies, in most of the areas, and indeed took office in most of the urban district and the urban councils, with the support in many instances of Labour. In the county council elections in June, they swept the boards. What really mattered here was what would be the attitude of the new elected councils to the local government board. They were instructed from the late summer of 1920 to withdraw their recognition of and any cooperation with the local government board, a major pillar of the British administration in Ireland. And that left them with a bit of a problem because, of course, they had to run their own show, they had to pay for services, they had to raise cash, and they had effectively to make their presence felt. Finances were a headache. Other factors in the rural areas was the sporadic outbreak of land issues continuing to erupt, notably in the west of Ireland, because of the suspension really of any further monies for a land purchase and distribution by the government from the outbreak of the war. It was put on ice, land acquisition and distribution, leading to pent-up frustrations. Sinn Féin were unable to deal with that directly through the local authorities, but there were tensions at local level about this in many of the rural areas. I think it's important to remember also that the Sinn Féin Dáil, so to speak, did have an administration that it built up and that it paid for. In the question of local government, for example, there were about 80 people employed by the Dáil Department of Local Government by the end of 1921. Clerical staff, surveyors and others, a sizable payroll, so to speak, for the unofficial or the counterstate that the Dáil was establishing. If local government was important, the administration of justice was also important. The administration of justice meant, in effect, the authority and effectiveness of the Dáil courts, which had emerged as arbitration Sinn Féin courts, but now had Dáil authority. There was considerable success for Sinn Féin and for the Dáil in making the Dáil courts acceptable widely, making them acceptable and making them effective. Because to be effective, their judgments had to be capable of being carried out. And here the volunteers were important, in other words, local IRA volunteers, who would be, in many instances, required to enforce the decisions of the Dáil courts. Not always, both parties frequently accepted, but they did, in fact, do very well. Now, it is a fact, of course, that the authority of the RIC was diminishing and of magistrates that had been part of the old system. As the RIC, for example, withdrew from smaller stations and retreated into the larger centres, and as their reputation became heavily tarnished, particularly when they had joint operations with the new brutal forces that came in 1920, that is to say the Black and Tans and afterwards the Auxiliaries. It happened that the authority of the apparatus for administering justice and for effectively implementing it, the RIC effectively were a wasting force from that point of view, and the effectiveness and even the personal security of the old magistrates and justices could no longer be guaranteed either. So with local government and indeed with the other things going on, the country effectively was having to come to terms with an alternative administration, a counterstate, an apparatus of government under the Dáil. The economic situation, very briefly, was extremely unstable. During the war years, agricultural prices had gone up hugely. Farmers generally could do well on this, but obviously they had overheads as well, where the costs went up. But from the autumn of 1920, agricultural prices fell and began to fall fairly steeply. Now, on the British market during the war years, Irish agricultural producers were able to effectively sell anything they liked. And many of them were careless about standards in poultry and in dairy produce. And accordingly, when the war ended, British consumers had a reason to try something new, had certainly what we would call consumer resistance, as it were, to Irish agricultural produce, Irish food. But on top of that, of course, prices generally were falling because of competition as the market was now being restocked from traditional sources. The result of it all, effectively, to put it in a nutshell, was that the spring of 1921 saw a real crisis of incomes for Irish farmers generally, and as they were squeezed, They themselves obviously had less purchasing power, and this had a run-on effect into the economy as a whole. These were the kind of issues, as I said, plus agitation over land erupting sporadically. These were the kind of issues, the kind of social unease, the kind of social dislocation and economic difficulties which existed in the spring of 1921. Now, it's within this wider framework, therefore, this broadly political options and social setting, as it were, that we can now turn in the final section to the position of the military conflict, that is to say, the state of the War of Independence in the spring of 1921. In the war, the Irish War of Independence from 1919 to 21, the intensity, the geographical concentration, and indeed even the phases of the various stages of the war and of violence varied considerably from place to place, from county to county, from region to region. For example, this has been illustrated in the Cork Atlas of the Irish Revolution, the distribution, the geographical distribution of incidents and of activities and of violence. More recently, there has been a comprehensive compilation of the number of fatalities and of the kind of fatalities, the categories of fatalities that took place over the entire period between 1917 and the end of 1921. And by that calculation, it confirms, of course, what we already knew, namely that the cockpit of the war was in Munster, where Tipperary had 158 casualties, Limerick 131, Clare 101, and Cork, of course, a massive 557 war-related casualties of all kinds in that period between 1917 and 1921. There were also high figures, as one might imagine, for Dublin, a major metropolitan area, and for County Antrim, principally related to disturbances and fatalities in the communal violence in Belfast. More than half the total fatalities of this period took place in 1921. And indeed, most of those in the first half of the year, between January and July of 1921. In the West, the active service units of the IRA were a little late, as it were, going on the offensive. But casualty rates again, or fatality rates, do illustrate their own story. Galway, for that period, 1917 to 21, had 65 war-related casualties, according to the latest compilation. Roscommon 62, Mayo 48, Leitrim 15, and Sligo 18. Even within counties, some units, brigades, and even battalions were more active than others. That is to say, they were more successful in securing arms and more ready to use them, depending very often on the quality of local leadership and also on opportunities. Guerrilla warfare is by its very nature opportunistic in terms of where an offensive can be mounted. Active volunteers, that is to say those involved directly in military engagements, were a relatively small core of the nominal volunteer numbers in all counties. And as the conflict continued and became more brutal and ruthless in execution, as it did throughout 1920 and on into the spring of 1921, the hard core of active volunteers, militarily active volunteers, tightened further. Understandably, under those circumstances, the active volunteers were predominantly young men between the ages of, let us say, 18 and 35. They were generally mobile and, as far as possible, free of family responsibilities. In terms of social class, the sons of small farmers were prominent. Now, that suffices as a general profile, though of course we could find plenty of exceptions to all of that. But that's the general profile, as it were, of the active units. There were, of course, many other ways of being active as a volunteer, besides being directly involved in a flying column or an active service unit in military engagements. There was intelligence gathering. There were a variety of communication roles. It's not accidental, for example, that a large number of postal workers were deemed extremely active and useful in this effort. And those who had opportunities of traveling from place to place. And at a time when local manufacturers, for example, distributed within particular areas, confectionery, mineral waters, perishable foods, and so on, with lorries or trucks going out, those who had familiarity with different areas could prove extremely useful in giving intelligence about the movement of Crown forces. And there were others as well, implementing, for example, court decisions, the Sinn Féin courts, and indeed even more passively providing safe houses. Spring of 1921 then sees the move towards the endgame in the War of Independence. In fact, throughout 1920 and through to the Truce of 1921, there is an ever-increasing intensity in the conduct of the military campaign. In November 1920, Lloyd George, in his speech at the Mayor's Ball in London, when he said that the government in Ireland had murder by the throat, he may have seemed to be making an idle boast in the light of some significant Republican successes at precisely the same time. After all, Bloody Sunday on the 21st of November, the Kilmichael ambush on the 28th of November inflicted serious damage, not only in strictly military terms, the number of fatalities, but also in terms of propaganda value and the morale boost to the IRA. But it is important not to get carried away or blinded by such Republican strikes. After all, Crown forces were well capable of swift and damaging retaliation and reprisal. Reprisals, as we know, could be immediate in the neighborhood or picking up suspects, or indeed reprisals were often delayed, served cold as it were, months or in some cases years after, and very often in different locations. The Crown forces did not forget those about whom they were suspicious or about whom they had evidence. In fact, the ruthlessness and willingness to inflict pain, not just on the volunteers or the combatants, but in different ways on the wider public, was very considerable and had gathered momentum throughout 1920, especially after the Restoration of Order Act in Ireland in August of 1920, and the arrival of the new forces, the Auxiliary Forces. The recruitment of special constables, for example, in the UK to support the RIC, who were experiencing loss of members through resignations or through indeed the loss of morale. From early 1920, this was one sign of the new get tough, as it were, disposition. The Black and Tans, by July of 1921, by the time of the truce, there had been about 7,700 or so Black and Tans had arrived. The total number before the end would be of the order of 10,000. The Auxiliaries began recruiting in July and began to feature from August and from early autumn of 1920, probably about 1,900 Auxiliaries in total. From a very early stage, the Crown forces probably knew that they were operating with virtual impunity. Now, impunity doesn't necessarily mean formal authority. Impunity means operating knowing that you were not going to be penalized for anything that you did. The sack of Balbriggan in September 1920, the burning of the centre of Cork City, the punishment meted out, as it were, the terrorising of the community of a whole was an important part of this. The burning of creameries and of businesses, which was at its height between August of 1920 and January of 1921, was a further way of counter-terror or of Crown Force official terror. Recent research, by the way, by Gemma Clark suggests that this question of burning, the burning of premises, the burning of houses, the burning of creameries, was not or should not be considered as simply the random acts of drunken Black and Tans, but became really an established or a recognized tactic by counter-terrorist forces acting for colonial powers, the British in this instance, but others as well. Certainly, there was no hesitation shown by Crown forces in inflicting individual exemplary punishment, including the murder of Thomas McCurtain, the Mayor of Cork, allowing Terence McSweeney to die on a protracted hunger strike, but also on the 1st of November 1920, the hanging of Kevin Barry, as the song said, the lad of 18 summers, the first hanging since 1916. And it must be said that the IRA itself was not reluctant at all to inflict exemplary punishments on those that it suspected. The Galway list of fatalities for 1920 illustrates a similar escalation of violence: tit-for-tat killings, the loosening of any restraint for the Black and Tans and the Auxiliaries, and the increasing ruthlessness of the IRA itself in offensive action towards Crown forces, and indeed towards alleged or proven informers, spies, or those described as collaborators. About 25 in all were the fatalities during 1920 for County Galway, with about 20 of these from the period June to December. The IRA was responsible for about half of these, mostly in the first half of 1920. The Crown Forces were more aggressive and ruthless from mid-1920. Their victims, as we know, included Sean Mulvoy and Seamus Quirk in September, Michael Walsh, Micheál Brannach from the Old Malt in October, Ellen Quinn, Kiltartan, the woman shot by the passing patrol, Father Michael Griffin, of course, Michael Moran, and the Loughnane brothers, notoriously brutal killing of the Loughnane brothers, all of these taking place in November. Now, this escalating violence towards the end of 1920 continued on into 1921. The policy of reprisals by government forces, burning of houses and so on, collective punishments, though in fact permitted, as I've said for some time, effectively got official approval from early 1921. The official policy was to get tougher with the IRA. The gloves had to come off. The ferocity of the Crown's attempt to get on top of the IRA in this period is striking. Reprisals and executions continue without let-up. Indeed, even in the months immediately preceding the truce, that is to say in the early summer, June and July, and while intermediaries were actually exploring the prospects for some talks, the size of the British garrison, the British troops in Ireland, increased with an influx of extra soldiers from the UK. There were plenty of Crown successes to boast of. The IRA itself suffered serious reverses in the first few months of 1921, even in the cockpit of Cork, in Upton on 15th of February, the disaster of Clonmult on the 20th of February, and Mourne Abbey in the 15th again. And the attacks though arms were in short supply in many districts in the south. There were disagreements and recriminations within brigade areas and across counties between local units and between local leaders in the central command. Specifically, there was criticism of Collins and of others for the difficulties in getting arms, the arms supply. Failure to secure a foreign supply, for example, prompted recriminations. Collins, for his part, and the General Headquarters, HQ generally, were critical of certain local units for underutilizing their arms and their opportunities. The intelligence war had seen the British side recover well from the setbacks of Bloody Sunday. Arrests and killings of key personnel inflicted significant damage on the IRA and inevitably led to heightened concern and obsession with informers and spies. Tit-for-tat killings assumed a grim rhythm and pattern. It's important, of course, not to exaggerate the cumulative impact of these difficulties and setbacks. The IRA continued throughout the first half of 1921 to have the capacity in different regions and in different areas to inflict casualties on the Crown Forces. I don't wish to give a long list of these, but there were plenty of them. Drumkeen in February in Limerick, Crossbarry in Cork in March, Scramogan and Roscommon in March, Tourmakeedy in early May, and others. But I think it's equally important not to underestimate or to ignore the difficulties confronting the Republican leadership, not least in the light of later claims by those on the treaty side that the IRA was almost beat, and on the other hand, by the diehards that they were ready to fight on, and that it was the British that were almost beat, as it were, by the early summer of 1921. In sum, the military conflict, it would probably be safe to conclude that by late spring 1921, the war had reached a stalemate. Some historians detect a marked pessimism in Michael Collins's appraisal of the military situation. His own intelligence fortress had been breached. His most valuable spy in Dublin Castle, Ned Broy, had been arrested in December of 1920. The net seemed to be closing in. The increased pressure on the IRA by Crown Forces was accompanied, of course, by determined efforts to disrupt the counterstate, that is to say, the apparatus and workings of the Republican underground government. This went beyond seizure of documents, pressure on banks to refuse credit. It extended to the killing of elected public representatives. Thomas McCurtain in Cork, I've mentioned already, in spring of 1920. Micheál Brannach in Galway in October 1920 also. John Geoghegan of Kilagoola Moycullen on the 20th of February 1921, an elected councillor. And indeed, even a week before the execution of Thomas Whelan, the then current Mayor of Limerick and his immediate predecessor were both murdered by Crown forces, Saoirse Clancy and Michael O'Callaghan. In fact, in the 10 weeks before Thomas Whelan's execution, that's to say from the 1st of January to the 14th of March, Galway itself had counted at least 12 Republican fatalities, including the Corna 4 who were drowned on the 6th of February, and of course the killings in Headford and Caherlistran on the 22nd of January. In conclusion, therefore, the execution of Thomas Whelan on the 14th of March 1921 was an event that fits with and is best understood as a feature of a decisive turn in the Anglo-Irish War or War of Independence. The immediate context of the execution, the personal journey, as it were, of young Thomas Whelan from Clifden to the Broadstone station, Dublin, and finally to the scaffold in Mountjoy, and all the controversy that surrounds his trial and execution, the state of war and the general conditions in his native West Connemara at the time of his execution and in the aftermath of his execution. All of these matters will be considered presently by those with specialist knowledge of these matters. In the wider Anglo-Irish context, the aftermath of this sad event would see renewed efforts through General Smuts of South Africa, through King George V in his speech at the opening of the Belfast Parliament on the 22nd of June 91, and through Lloyd George's continuing machinations as he sought to cling to power, they would see renewed efforts, as I say, to create an opportunity for reaching compromise, for sounding out the possibility of some accommodation between the Dáil leadership and the British government. A truce followed in July of 1921, followed shortly by talks that would lead to the treaty at the close of the year. But in respect of Northern Ireland, the bird had flown. James Craig and company had wasted no time. They had set up their own security apparatus, including the Special Constabulary, and they began recruiting early the key senior loyalist administrative personnel for their administration in Belfast, which would soon become unmovable. In retrospect, therefore, we can see the available options more clearly. We can identify the key steps, the dates and events that would ultimately prove decisive for the settlements of 1922 to 25, including partition and the establishment of the government of the Irish Free State, or Saoirstát Éireann. But at the approach of Patrick's Day in 1921, none of this was clear. Much seemed in flux and still in play, as the pall of grief on Broth Broin came down on Clifden with the news of the execution in Dublin of young 22-year-old Thomas Whelan on this day a century ago.